Yes, well, thank you for joining us. This is a presentation that we did at the World Conference for ASQ back in May. It was very exciting. We were really honored to be selected to present leadership tools on how to operationalize equity in the medical device design control process. So, Vicki, thank you so much for the introduction. We'll just do another quick introduction myself. Yeah, I've got three ASQ certifications. I'm certified quality engineer, certified medical device auditor, and a certified software quality engineer. These certifications really summarize my experience in the medical device and combination products industries, where I've built quality management systems from the ground up for small startups and even large companies, and even startups within large companies. So I've had a lot of hands-on experience from the development process all the way through to post-market monitoring. And so my last position, I was the head of quality management systems and the head of quality systems policies at Google Health. That was my last position last year. Since then, I've on this sabbatical created the Quality Academy for Excellence, where I've released a series of white papers, and that's how I got in communications with Jenna, because I am a Cornell University alumni, electrical engineering. And so, Jenna, why don't you give a little more of a summary of yourself?
Excellent. Thank you, Lorianne. So, like Lorianne mentioned, I am a current biological engineering undergraduate. I'm a senior at Cornell University. We connected via LinkedIn since I was a student leader on the Cornell University biomedical device team. And I had the manpower, and Lorianne had all this expertise. And that led to us kicking off a white paper. And we're going to go in more to depth in this later. But I am also a co founder of Melanoxy Pulse Oximeter LLC, which is a company formed from the product developed by Cornell University Biomedical Device. And it's patented. We're currently looking for funding, just going through that process of business right now. So that's my background, and I'm so happy to be here today. So thank you for having me.
And that photo was taken at Cornell when I visited it's been a year now, back in September.
Yeah, to come present.
Yes. Great.
Oops, I forgot I was in charge. My bad.
Okay. Okay, so learning objectives. So we're going to definitely lead for a future in health equity, right? So as you know, the CFRs right now, Code of Federal Regulations, don't really address equity, but we want to be the ones that really implement these great practices. So we really want to optimize how your team is going to really operationalize the concepts that we're going to present today, and then also implement these medical device design control practices. So we're going to really today focus on the design control process that's part of the overall quality management system regulation. And then we're going to embed these health equity principles into your overall quality management system, because we're going to actually touch on the rest of the quality management system pretty much on the last slide.
So we really want to emphasize from the human population, like from a like ethics perspective, this is the right thing to do, but this is also going to help your business and is smart from a financial and business making decision perspective. So, by designing products that are optimized for the user needs of your target population, if you look at you're designing a new product, your whatever that might be, you have a target population, you want to make sure you're fitting the user needs and designing a product all the way throughout the design and development process that really caters to all of your users and not just one certain demographic or subpopulation. And, and this drastically will decrease your customer complaints. And subsequently, you're less likely to have violations and get those FDA 483s, which obviously you want to avoid. And ultimately, it saves you time and money. I don't know about the rest of you, but as an engineer, I've certainly had errors, especially in former prototypes, where we've needed to go back to design and rethink, okay, how do we re-AutoCAD this? How do we redesign this? And it's a lot of work and it can be costly. It's costly in human resources, time, money. So you want to really get it right the first time. And ultimately, when you design products that are really thoughtful and mindful of the user needs, of all of the different sub demographics and intersectionalities of all of the different users of your target population to the best of your ability, you prevent delayed diagnoses and save lives. And I think that's going to be more evident with our example as we trace through the pulse oximeter later in the presentation.
So historically, we know that the quality management system regulations, the intent is really to provide this good regulatory framework that a company would base their policies and their procedures on, right? So that the medical devices that are developed are designed safely and they're also efficient. So safety and efficacy is a word that you will see throughout all of the guidance documents of the FDA, right? It's their primary objective. However, there are no requirements in the regulations specifically for equitable design. Now, biased medical devices obviously will compromise the efficacy of the design. And we're going to talk a lot about that. Um, so, Jenna, why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Okay. So moving on to the next slide,
Yes.
this is becoming increasingly important because the United States is actually moving towards a majority minority. We really, I mean, it's a market potential is what it is from a business perspective. The market is opening up to more diverse consumers and more diverse populations, and as businesses we need to respond to that, and we need to design products that are looking at this diverse market and responding to user needs, especially as this transition happens. So when this does not, when you do not think of the whole population and you only think of one subcategory, you might only be optimizing for a very small subcategory, like 25% of the population. If you, for example, only have white males in clinical trials, that's really limiting of the whole product needs of the whole population. And that's going to give you a high probability of errors. And like I mentioned earlier, that results in lots of complaints, design changes, and it's costly. So, I mean, really, as a business choice, you also need to think, is it going to be easier if you spend money to train people or to hire a company to train people or have some vertical intermission? Or is it going to be more costly if you make design changes? And in almost every situation, it's going to be a lot more costly to go back and have to make those changes. So if you do not operationalize equity, you're going to get complaints, and ultimately that's lost profit, in addition to the human cost and that toll behind it too, of course, which is more important.
All right. So let's talk a little bit about device clearance versus approval. So earlier I said that, yeah, there are no CFRs, no laws that push for equitable practices. However, the FDA does have equity-based clinical guidance, right? There are some really wonderful guidance documents that talk about race and diversity plans, clinical plans that need to ensure that you're including people in the demographics of where you're going to launch your product in. However, when you the clinical trials, first of all, that process, that testing happens in the design validation stage. So by the time you get to that design validation stage, that means they're going to be testing people, whether it's human factors or clinical trials, they're going to be testing it with models that possibly have built-in bias at that point. So you kind of like it's like a negative effect. You're going to get failures, and because these are principles based on guidance, they're a little bit loose. So you can just easily report, well, we had some anomalies, we had some failures, but you can go on and get your approval for your device. Secondly, 98% of all devices are cleared by the 510(k) process, which does not require any clinical studies. So then the problem with that is with the 510(k) process, you're building your whole regulatory submission by comparing your new product with a product that's already on the market. So if that product that's been on the market, and we're going to talk about a specific product that we know has built-in bias, and I have a new product, I'm going to compare it to that. So now I'm going to cascade that bias into my product, and then the problem still exists. So hence there's a really need for new principles to make sure that not only do we address equity in clinical process, but we need to really have equitable principles built in from the beginning of the development process. So, hence, let's talk about uh, the situation that happened during COVID. And I like to say, earlier I was saying I actually was born and raised in New York. And during COVID, I actually lived in Long Island. And in Long Island, that's where COVID actually broke out. My husband worked at the hospital where you had the first cases of COVID. And I have relatives that live in Elmhurst, Queens, where they had the most deaths that happened. And luckily, thank God, my family, we were vigilant. I was on the phone, we were calling, we were making sure we're following proper practices. But unfortunately, after that happened, I found out actually through a LinkedIn post that pulse oximeters actually gave false readings to people that had darker skin tones. And they found out that a lot of people's lives could have been saved if those oximeters were not faulty. They were yielding good readings when really they were not the correct readings because they really weren't reading through the darker skin tone um, patients. So, and this is even the reason why I even started the white paper because then I started to realize, well, are there any guidance documents that talk about building equity in the development process from the beginning? And my mind just started spinning and started seeing that, hey, why isn't this being addressed? If this is a significant problem that the FDA is actually recognizes, where are the solutions? And the solutions can't start at the design validation stage for clinical trials. It has to start before then.
So I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit here, but just to break down a little bit of a science and show you how extreme the problem is, especially with pulse oximeters, is that there's a really low range of accuracy. So if your SpO2 or your blood oxygen saturation level is above 95% at sea level, that's considered a good or healthy normal reading. However, if it's at 92, you might not feeling great. At 88, I mean, you're probably on oxygen. In fact, at 92, you might have undiagnosed peripheral cardiovascular disease if you regularly have readings that are that low. So, to give you an idea, Black patients are 3 times as susceptible of of having missed diagnosis of hypoxemia or this low blood oxygen saturation levels in the blood. And subsequently, when there's all of these false negatives, especially since it's a preliminary diagnostic technique, it really does delay diagnoses and does delay a lot of people with darker skin pigmentations from getting help. So then, it got me thinking, oh my gosh, this is a lot of pulse oximeters. Oh, and by the way, this study is citing ICU pulse oximeters. So it's pulse oximeters throughout the whole system, whether you buy whether you're using one in ICU and you're super sick or it's just over the counter in CVS. This is a standard problem,
Yes.
regardless. So it got us thinking, like what Lorianne said, how is this allowed by industry regulations, that we have products that are not quite at the efficacy and safety levels for all users of
Yeah.
different devices. So,
We created a white paper. I know I was so taken back by to find out the information regarding this oximeter, and not only oximeters, there were also forehead temperature probes. Again, I've even worked with colleagues that said, yeah, they didn't work on me, or they got stopped at the door when they were feeling fine, and so, nevertheless, because I couldn't find any regulations, or I couldn't find any guidance documents on equitable practices in the early development process, I decided to generate some new principles, and then also connected with the Cornell Biomedical Device Project team, and we used their melanoxy oximeter as a case study in the white paper. So we really encourage you all to uh, take a screenshot of that, and that's actually a QR code that will take you directly to the paper. We've also left a link for the paper in the chat as well for you to access it.
and at the end of our slides, we do link it again, and I'm sure we'll send it in the chat again. But we really hope one of our goals coming out of this presentation today is that you bring this back to your organizations and you introduce this to the teams that you're working on and actually help introduce some of the principles that we're using today and some of the new guidances introduced in our paper in order to solve some of the problems that we mentioned. Okay.
All right, so from this point on, we're really going to do a deep dive into the medical device design control process, and we will be using the Melanoxy oximeter as a case study. So I'll just give a quick overview of the design control process based on, the CFRs, which have recently adopted ISO 13485. You've got the planning process, which sets the stage and the project planning for the entire development of the product, and then you create product requirements or and your user needs through your design inputs that gets translated into specifications, outputs. And then once you have all of your output specifications and requirements, you create design builds, you manufacture design builds that then will get tested, verified that they actually meet the design inputs. And then also at that point, if the builds pass, then you use them to perform validation. And so we said earlier, 98% of devices on the market are cleared by the 510K. So 9 times out of 10, your validation is really going to be the bulk of your validation will be through the human factors studies, right? Of summative studies. And then at that point, you transfer it to manufacturer, you scale up, and you're ready to go. And then throughout the entire process, you've got change control and risk management, and you're building your design and development file. So let's go to the first stage of development on the next slide, which is the design development plan. So through these slides, I will summarize what the actual regulations are, and then I will bring in what our proposed equitable practice would be to embed into the process that you already have. So the design development process is the first step of a medical device in development. So the DDP should be established and include an overall project plan with deliverables and goals that reflect all phases of the development process. And it should be kept up to date as design progresses. Then this ensures that the medical device development process is controlled and compliant with the regulatory requirements of the country that it will be launched in. So the DDP can be an overall plan, or it could just be actually can be one plan, or it can be an overall plan that has multiple sub-plans. So what we propose is that your product development team, which again needs to be established up front, their qualifications and requirements, but the product development team should also be diverse. And here's the reason why. If I have if I'm developing a product and it's all, um, you know, white American males, then it's going to be really hard to bring in diverse requirements. It would be best to have a team that is diverse to reduce bias in the overall product. Next slide. So now the quality and regulatory plan again. So it could be a part, like I said, part of the design development plan, or it could have usually at companies that I've worked for, it's easier to actually have these plans as separate documents, and then you can just reference them in the overall DDP. Other companies, they'll have it all in one big plan. So typically in the quality and regulatory plan, well, the regulatory part will outline the regulatory strategy of how the product will be submitted for FDA approval for clearance into the market, and with any other intended market strategies or any other countries. So then this will drive the quality planning to determine what type of quality management system is required for the development, production, and post-market monitoring of product. So now, now you can do a click. What we propose in our quality plan is that we include a fairness statement in your quality policy, because every company is required to have a quality policy, or at least if you're launching in the United States, then the ISO regulations and also 21 CFR 820, now they're combined. They all require that you have a quality policy. So why not also add a fairness statement? And we have it right here. Our products are designed and developed with fairness through equitable and development practices. Now, why is this so important? Because as you know, those of you who are in quality, you know that your quality policy is the driver for all of your policies and procedures. So this is the top level document or policy in your system. And so now all of the other SOPs, you need to make sure that they're going to comply. So you're going to have some equitable principles embedded throughout your entire quality management system. Another thing that the quality plan that typically addresses is supplier evaluation and qualification. So an example we used in our paper was, okay, if you have artificial intelligence and machine learning driven medical devices, then you're going to be buying a lot of data sets from independent vendors and suppliers. That data is going to be used to train your model. So it's really important that you vet your supplier and ensure that the data that they're providing you is free of bias. And you can even ask them to have a fairness statement on their certificate of release every time they provide you the data. Next bullet, Jen. Um, in your regulatory plan also, um, let's say if you're making an oximeter, right? So you already know that you're comparing your new product with predicates that have bias. So you want to make sure that the bias stops here. I know that my predicates have bias, and I don't want to cascade that bias into my product. So Jenna, and in this plan, typically in the quality and regulatory plan, you're going to outline what are the resources used to make this product. And so we would also want to include a subject matter expert on health equity in-house. Now, we do have a really good slide towards the end of the presentation that shows you that, and we have a scaled approach on how to add resources. And it's actually won't be that expensive because I'm sure people are thinking about, oh, resources are always expensive. Well, we have a scaled approach that we think would make sense. Next slide, Jenna. All right, now the design health equity plan. So again, this is not an FDA requirement, and there is no guidance on it. So this is a new principle that we proposed in our paper. So this planning document should really provide an overall strategy on how to implement equitable principles throughout the development process. Right. Um, so then Jenna is actually going to talk about the health equity oriented strategy that was actually put out by the CDC.
Sure. So for the health equity oriented strategy that is already in guidance by the CDC, as Lori mentioned, there are a few different things that they do recommend that we thought were really great practices to adopt. So that's like balancing community input with the available evidence that's out there, and then creating design strategies that are able to identify inequalities. That way, you're prepared for when bias does come up and you already have a strategy and a plan in place in order to combat that and optimize your product. You also want to make sure that your strategies are comprehensive. So you have a comprehensive approach of strategies and not just a single one hits all type strategy for equity because things are complicated. The world is complicated. You need to make sure your plan really is thorough in order to meet a variety of situations. Additionally, you want to make sure that there is an established process in order to identify and implementate challenges. This is realistic, especially when you're doing something new and you are trying to fit a larger audience. In general, this is just a good practice to have is to have these strategies, but especially when you're doing something a little bit new and changing things up a bit, it's extra important that you have processes in place already so that when these problems do come up, you already have a fallback, you already have a plan. And then the last thing is to really account for the diversity of your intended population, like what we keep coming back to.
Mhm. Right. Another thing that we discussed in the health equity plan, um, the strategies that we have really comes from something that was released by the government in 2022. The White House released a blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, which speaks to algorithmic discrimination protections. So, and what they say is that there should be like an algorithmic impact assessment including disparity testing results and mitigation information. And this should be performed and should be made public. So that's for AI in general, not just for medical devices. But when I read this blueprint, I felt that recommendation, because again, it's a blueprint. It's not an actual bill. It's a blueprint for a bill, and I'm really hoping that it gets passed soon. But I wanted to extract that as a principle because that could be done for any kind of medical device to perform these equity assessments. So we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to the design review stage. The design health equity plan also addresses making sure that people are trained. Um, Typically, we would prefer the project manager over the development process is trained and certified, or you have a subject matter expert in health equity on your team, and then everyone should have DEI training and any training that they would need to make sure that they're uh, being inclusive when they're building a new medical device.
So, in our white paper, as I mentioned already, we use melanoxy as the case study. And on the slides following this, we're going to be walking through a traceability matrix just to show you what an equitable principle looks like and how easy it is. So the reason why specifically pulse oximeters are not as accurate on people and give these false negatives on people with darker skin pigmentations is simply because they use light. That is the methodology. The amount of light that's diffracted and absorbed is obviously impacted by different colors. And subsequently, just by adding a light that is able to penetrate people with darker skin tones easier, that problem is fixed. Another possible solution is adding multiple lights. And just with a simple calibration and one more light, the problem is solved. So we're going to now talk about how you do this through equitable principles.
Okay, so this is like a template, an example. I'm sure those of you who are in product development and in quality, who are auditing design history files, you're going to look for a traceability matrix. And so we're starting with the second stage of development, which will be establishing your design inputs. So in this traceability matrix, we have identified user need. So we've got UN1, all of the user needs, which are high level requirements. They should all be identified and indexed so they could be traced all the way from the design input all the way through to verification and validation. So we give an example for melanoxy, which would be user need number one, provide an accurate measurement of blood oxygen. So as you guys who are engineers know that user needs can have multiple design inputs. So DI, so we're not going to list all of them, but we're going to focus on DI2, the equitable requirement.
So, like Lorian mentioned, we're just going to be tracing one thing throughout the entire matrix, and it's going to be sequential. So, pay attention. So, in order to get an accurate measurement of blood oxygen, an example of a design input that's equitable would be that the difference is less than 0.5% between skin tone ranges to ensure that you're truly getting that safety and efficacy regardless of the levels of melanin in people's skin.
Now that we have that equitable requirement example, okay, now we're going to need a design output. So a design output, so the design input is that high level requirement, and now a design output, it will get translated to an actual specification that needs to be reviewed and approved by your team. Because as you know, design outputs are, this could be specifications, they could be drawings, they could be work instructions. It's basically the preliminary recipe for your design builds to be built against. So it's basically a bunch of requirements that have been translated into formal and approved documents in your quality management system.
So, an easy way to do this is to have the Monk skin tone scale specification, or another example would be the Fitzpatrick skin tone scale. So, if you've ever gone and bought makeup, maybe you've seen one of these little bars of scales of different skin pigmentation ranges. And really, you just need to make sure that on the output, you're using a scientific tool. So, as opposed to like an ethnicity, you're using a scientific tool of skin pigmentation levels to classify and make sure it really is accurate on all different skin tone pigmentations and ranges.
All right, so the design, let's talk about the design verification plan because we've got a design input. Now we have our design output specification. So the design verification planning document, it provides an outline of the activities needed to provide evidence that the design input requirements have actually been met. So this is achieved through, of course, objective evidence, through testing and inspection of the production builds that were manufactured according to the design output requirements, right? So this also includes an analysis of the results to ensure that the product passes the verification testing. Now, Plans for verification, it also includes the verification strategy along with worst case analysis of critical and major design points to make sure the product is reliable. So, in your worst case analysis of your design verification plan, you, we propose that you include the target population demographic in your testing range. You want to include some worst case of that are related to inequity and bias. And again, we've already have the worst case scenario for that monk skin tone scale. And also your risk management plan. I'm sure you all know this, but your design verification plan needs to have feedback to the risk management plan. And the risk management plan should also address any issues that could happen based on inequity and bias. Oh, and of course, for those who are making medical devices that are AI machine learning driven, I said earlier, unbiased data, but also you need to make sure the tools that you're using to build your model and test your model are free of bias as well.
So if we jump back to the case study and we think about what design verification would look like in our traceability matrix, we have once again, uh, we're now at the verification stage, like I mentioned. So we need to make sure the design builds past the test for pulse oximeter specifically. The way that this is done is through an arterial blood gas test. So an arterial blood gas test would be actually validation if it's done in a person, but if you replicate this and you have blood pumping through a machine that's being oxygenated and you have sort of a human system replicated in a lab and you're doing the arterial blood gas saturation test on that and comparing how much light is being received back by the pulse oximeter, that would be an example of how you could do that for a pulse oximeter or ours specifically.
Okay, so now hopefully the bills that you made passed all the verification testing requirements. And so we're going to use those same design builds to actually test on humans or in the simulated case. So the design validation planning document needs to outline the process of how the user needs and the intended use of the device can be verified under actual or simulated conditions. So along with the human factors summative testing, this is the stage where the end user can test the device before it goes to the market. So the design validation planning document should outline processes needed to achieve the intended use. And I'm going to quote the FDA: the performance characteristics that are to be assessed should be identified, and validation methods and acceptance criteria should be established. Straight out of the FDA guidance document. So design validation planning should ensure that outputs from the human factors summative studies and clinical investigations are all tied to the risk management process, and they're evaluated under this stage of development. So the good thing about this stage, we talked about it earlier at the beginning of the slide deck, is that the FDA has really good guidance documents that state that if you're doing clinicals, and I think even probably in their human factors guidance, really users that you're going to use in these studies should be based on the intended use of the demographics of where you're going to launch your product in. The FDA has like a race and ethnicity diversity plan um, where we're required to enroll representative numbers of participants from underrepresented 19 racial and ethnic populations in the United States: Black and African American, Hispanic, Latino, Indigenous, Native American, Asian, Hawaiian, and other 21 Pacific Islanders and other persons of colors. This is for clinical trials. Um, so again, but like we said earlier, if you're going to do all of that work, you need to make sure that the design bills that you're going to use to test humans on, that they're going to be as free of bias as possible, because then you're going to be guaranteed failures. And then if that happens, either you'll write it off as an anomaly, because this is, again, that's just based on guidance right now, or if the FDA cracks down, you have to go back and actually go back to your design input stage and create new requirements, because you're going to have to do your risk management process. If you have a good risk management process, you will have to mitigate those failures. And like I said earlier, um, bias is not just based on skin tone. There's bias with age. There's bias with gender. There's bias with disabilities. There are cultural biases. I mean, the list goes on.
There we go.
Okay.
So once again, here we have the traceability matrix for melanoxy, and we talked about verification. We're now on validation, and this would be actually testing it on users. And just to reiterate how narrow the range is, like how important it is that you consider like your entire target audience and the impact of that. The science is narrow for pulse oximeters. 95% is healthy. 92% is you literally might have a misdiagnosis of peripheral cardiovascular disease. That's a real issue. So that 3% difference is is a problem. So if it's 3% off, that's literally the difference between somebody getting the treatment and the help that they need and that being completely missed. So it's alarming that the standard in the industry now and the pulse oximeters, as of today, used in the ICU, used in hospitals, clinics, healthcare centers across the United States, in addition to the ones people buy in pharmacies, are not providing that accuracy and that level of safety that you would hope it would for all users. So we got to really consider predicates and how predicate is built into processes and think about that when we do builds, just to reiterate one more time. But back to validation, you're then doing um, the arterial blood gas test on a real patient, and you're then comparing that to the pulse oximeter. Anything else, Lorian?
No, that's excellent. All right, so the software development plan. If your product has software in it, IAC 62304 is an excellent standard that provides guidance on how to develop medical device software, whether it's integrated software or software as a medical device, standalone. So the software development plan should address all activities for the development's life cycle, right? Classification of the software, the type of the processes that you're going to use to develop the software, establishment and the traceability of software requirements, what tools you're going to use, your risk measures, your configuration management, change management. It covers this. IEC 62304 is a very solid standard for software development. What is prevention of bias in the software? So, we've talked about it before, but when you're developing software, establish some equitable software requirements to prevent bias in your data sets and bias in the tools that are used to test your model. And then lastly, this is the one of the most important things. If you're launching your product in the United States, the FDA requires that you classify your software when it's called a risk level of concern. One more click, Jenna. So misdiagnosis due to bias should be a major level of concern. So those oximeters that are released on the market that have been misdiagnosing people with darker skin tones, they should have really classified the software used to drive the pulse oximeters as a major level of concern. And if they did that, then through the risk management process, they would have mitigated it and put in preventative measures. So, like this, I really like this slide because it's really important to um, consider bias when you're establishing your major level of concern. Next slide. All right, so the human factors plan. I know we talked a lot about the risk management plan. Let's talk about the human factors plan. The FDA does have a very strong guidance document, and it's called Applying Human Factors and Usability Engineering to Medical Devices. So, this intends to support manufacturers on improving your design to minimize potential use errors and harms. So, your planning document for the human factors needs to outline the process of how you identify and eliminate hazards associated with the use of the device. And also, this human factors plan should be tied in with the risk management plan because the risk management process definitely will mitigate all of the hazards that have been identified by the human factors plan. And Jenny, you can just click all four of them. So, the important thing to add to your human factors plan is your sample size of the subjects that you will use in your study should be based or represent the demographics of your intended population. And your hazards also should be based also on socioeconomic status, language, trust, and willingness to use, and cultural differences. Now, this is very near and dear to my heart because even during COVID, the good thing is that there was a huge initiative to get African Americans to trust taking the vaccine. And I'm going to tell you, I was one of the people that lacked trust in the beginning. I ended up getting vaccinated, but because I know about the Tuskegee experiments, of the 1970s, and read about it, horrific experiments that were done on, my people. Yeah, so in my community, when I talk with my relatives and my friends, there is a big mistrust that needs to be dealt with. So a lot of us are not willing to participate in clinical trials or studies for new products because we just because of what happened. Cultural differences. So my husband is from South America. Now his skin is 3 times dark as mine, right? But he wasn't born here in America. So maybe his family, maybe there is a willingness to use and a willingness. So this goes beyond skin tone. We have to take into account all types of diversity because just because someone is of one color, but if you're of a different culture, that's a difference. So all of that has to be taken into account when you're doing testing on in human factors planning.
So now we're going to talk a little bit about cybersecurity. So we already talked about software, and it's commonly known. I'm sure everybody gets the classic work training on phishing and scams, and are just so prevalent in everybody's lives that you might be aware of it on a personal level for protecting your finances. But we also have to remember that when we're designing products, they need to also be impenetrable to security threats, especially when we are designing software and products related to health. You do not want people's information to be compromised. You do not want the cybersecurity you do not want cybersecurity to somehow become unsafe. And specifically with medical devices, they are more likely to be helping people. Um, I mean, health impacts everybody, low in income and vulnerable populations are higher threat risk. But with medical devices, like I mentioned, we have to be really conscientious that they are secure and that they do not have bias from a software perspective, as Lorianne mentioned, and that although the FDA does require cybersecurity mitigation to be a part of the development process and post market monitoring, it should also really take into account the backgrounds of the low income and the vulnerable populations that are a higher threat because they often do lack the resources and the training. Another thing is after something's on the market, it needs to be able to sometimes get updates in
Mhm.
order to prevent cybersecurity too. So these are all things to think about when you're doing the design and development process.
Okay. Um, you could click on everything here because I think we're almost at the end. And yeah, I want to have enough time for questions. So the last three stages, we'll talk about design review, design changes, and design transfer. So the design review process, as you know, it's important to have those stage gates to make sure that what I've done in the previous stage, that everything is completed before we move to the next stage. That's the whole purpose of design review. So we propose that you have, so we talked about those equity assessments earlier, right? So we could merge the equity assessments as part of your design review checklist to make sure that any equitable requirements and practices have been realized in the previous stage as well. So again, that would be a health equity expert or a subject matter expert on the design team to be that independent assessor over your design review stage. They can also check and make sure that we've been following that health equity plan. Now, change control is really important, especially when you're talking about artificial intelligence models, because they're always going to be changing. But the FDA does have predetermined change control plan requirements in their guidance. Now, all change control plans, whether it's for AI or for medical device hardware, you always have to do that impact assessment, right? So when you do a change, you do an impact assessment, and you do that assessment before you implement the change. So in your impact assessment, also consider, does that change impact diversity? Uh, um, does that change have an impact on the design when it comes to equitable design of the product? That's really critical. And for design transfer, that's when you create your plan for post market monitoring. That's when you establish key performance indicators to monitor your product on the market. So now in your plan, you can create key performance indicators that are equitably based. And so here's an example. If you did find some residual risks, and residual risks are risks that you find in your development process, but you're justifying them and saying, well, the risk is the benefit is greater than the risk. Now, if you have residual risks based on demographic data, I would create a KPI for that and monitor that and see if the occurrence is higher and determine if that risk needs to be reassessed. And I think the next two slides, Jenna, will go through that really quickly. How do we include expertise in organizations? This is the scaled approach. If you have a small team, certify your product development lead. If you've got a medium sized organization, you can afford to contract a health equity expert. Or if you worked at a large organization like Google that I worked for, they have a whole vertical organization on health equity. Next slide.
So just remember, the product isn't just pulse oximeters. So many products already on the market, 98% of new products are based off of predicate, which results on this bias being perpetrated. And it's not just the medical device industry. Arguably, that's the most important place. But when products in general do not consider all populations, such as male or dummies are used in car crashes,
Mhm.
because it's based off of the design of males, women are much more likely to die in car wrecks. Poor air quality impacts like communities of lower socioeconomic status. So even though we are talking about health equity today, and everybody here might be more inclined, might is probably from that industry, we have to think about it in the context of all engineering and all industries, but especially in the context of health and all biomedical devices. And then just reiterating, the FDA's objective is safety and efficacy, and this needs to be for everybody, for your whole target population that will be using the product. Because as you saw with the pulse oximeter, under or misrepresentation is dangerous, it is costly, and it impacts people's lives, and that's not right. So make sure that you design for all users, and by doing so, you're expanding your target population, and ultimately you prevent those 483s, you prevent complaints, you improve the reputation of your company by designing for all, um, and those design changes are costly. So hopefully you
Okay.
have.
Yeah, we'll just wrap it right here. Gain familiarity with the practices that we presented, recognized how, as a leader, you can operationalize these principles and learning how to apply these principles when you're designing devices. And yeah, so let's go to the last slide. Yes, stating what Jenna said, it's the right thing to do, and it's not going to be that expensive. If anything, you'll get a profit. And the last slide, we've got the QR code for our paper, and hopefully we have time just for a few questions.
And we can drop that link again too.
So thank you so much for bringing to our attention the need for this. This is a most important thing that we need to be focused on when we are doing our design of not only medical devices, but anything. So questions from the audience, please enter them into the chat, and we'll go ahead and make sure our presenters are able to address those.
How do we feel the new transition of the QSR to 1345 will help your efforts? Oh, I love this question. Um, what's interesting is that I was able to comment on the ISO 1340, thank you, ISO 1345 updates. I believe it was back in September, no, actually maybe no, November of last year. And so my comment, so they actually, the ISO standards, they have my comments that are based on what we presented today. Now, will they get translated? I don't know. But the impact is this. Now, I really need, because before I was sending out our paper to the FDA, right, for them to change the CFRs or at least do guidance documents. But now we've got another stream, which is ISO 13485. So I did initiate that effort, at the end of last year, but I feel like I still need to do some groundwork to try to hit 13485 because I think that's the better strategy right now. Thank you for that question.